Hello, and welcome to our Friday Digest. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kristen Harbison. I'm the political director for Maryland League of Conservation Voters. And if you've joined us before, you know that this is our Friday Digests are here to provide you with information, tools, and resources to be an informed and active advocate. Being with us for these weekly digests speaks to the power of our community and to your commitment to the solutions that will create a healthy environment for everyone in Maryland. We always want the agenda for these virtual meetings to be driven by you and your interests and needs. So let us know what you want to hear about. The easiest way to provide this information is to fill out the survey you'll receive at the end of this session. And as you join again, please type your name into the chat and tell us where you're joining from. As we move through the half hour we have to get together today, put your questions and comments in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. Today's session is around democracy protection and our elections. I am thrilled to welcome Jake Weissman is on the State Board of Elections, which is made up of 5 members who serve 4-year terms representing both political parties. And we are thrilled to have him join us. He is a newly confirmed member of the Board of Elections. Is that right, Jake? And then Justin Kwasa is with the Democracy Program Director for our partners at the National League of Conservation Voters. And his work at LCV, Justin works to empower others to demand that their voice be heard by our elected officials. So thank you again so much for both of us for joining us. Just to get started, Justin, can you give us a little bit of an overview of the current state of voting rights and elected official protections across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you see, like what's happening across the country, is pulling 2 very different ways. So I think you have states like Maryland and other states that are doing a really great job of pushing forward a lot of the best practices that we have for voting rights. So making sure we have early voting, absentee balloting, automatic voter registration, really doing everything that they can in order to make sure, particularly after the pandemic happened, that people have multiple ways in order to vote. But then you also have, on the other hand, a lot of push in the opposite direction, where folks are getting voter IDs, or trying to establish voter IDs, or in particular with Georgia and Arizona, really doing very specific legislation in order to disenfranchise certain election officials so that they can or can't do their work. So whether it's the Secretary of State in Arizona, or whether it's county clerks in Georgia, we see a lot of pushback in order to make sure that we can limit how much folks can advocate and protect voters as well. So I think you have polar opposites, where you have a lot of great work being done and a lot of really suppressive work being done. And kind of in the middle of all that, we have a little bit of a logjam in DC in order to try to solve and address all those things.
Great, thanks, Justin. And Jake, so in the middle of all this is the Board of Elections, but I'm not sure that people really understand what that means. So can you tell us a little bit more about the Board of Elections and its role in protecting our voting rights and election security? What do you do with the Board of Elections? What does that look like?
I appreciate that, and thanks for having me on. I was told it would be an opportunity to spend a half hour talking to my friend Kristen, and that was what it took to sell me. And I do have to say, as an aside, I've worked with LCV for a long time, and you are such an asset to this organization in the halls of Annapolis. Incredibly well respected and well regarded, and just appreciate the opportunity. I've sat on the Board of Elections now for about 7.5 months. I got appointed at the very end of May, so maybe 8.5 months, and I should learn how to do math. But the mission of the State Board has been around in some form or another for about 80 years, but in its current form since 1997. And it's to provide all eligible citizens of the state convenient access to voter registration, make sure that all registered voters have accessible locations in which they can exercise their right to vote, ensure uniformity of election practices across all 23 counties in Baltimore City, promote fair and equitable elections, maintain registration records, campaign fund reports, and other election-related data accurately in a form that's accessible to the public. The State Board of Elections, though, it's funny because it is both used for the term of the administrator, Jared Demarinis, and his staff, as well as the actual board. And so the 5-member board of which I sit on, we currently have 4 members. Our job is to oversee the work of the administrator and staff. And so, for example, we have a meeting coming up next week where we will vote on a series of regulations that interprets the legislation that the General Assembly has produced. We have been finalizing the polling place locations and the early voting locations that have been sent to us by the counties. And what we are trying to do is ensure that folks' right to vote is protected and that people can have faith that we have secure and accessible elections throughout the state.
That is really, and also I appreciate the nice things you say. I promise I didn't pay him to say that. Thank you so much. And
okay, we just won't talk about the money you gave me. Okay.
You are a perfectly ethical person, and so am I. So this would never happen. But just going back to some of the idea when you're talking about the legislation that the Board of Elections then interprets. Going back to Justin, what are some of the legislative goals? What's some of the legislation that you're seeing nationally and in Maryland that we can talk about that are aimed at protecting voting rights? And can you talk a little bit? So from National LCV nationally, like Maryland LCV, we work at the intersection of climate change, environmental justice, environmental protection. And how do these voting rights impact environmental policies?
Absolutely. Long question. I will try to make this as succinct as possible. But first of all, when we look at what's happening on the federal level, there are 3 main bills that we're looking at in order to try to pass in order to protect voting rights. So number one is the Freedom to Vote Act, which, as I talked about earlier, those are basically all the best practices of voting rights accessibility that pass all into one. It's an omnibus bill, and we're trying to pass it. And so we usually see that as the offensive. That's saying being aggressive and saying, hey, in all 50 states, because obviously we know that in America, there's 50 different methods that you can do it because there's 50 different states. So making sure that across the board, we have the same standards, which are the best, most accessible standards across the board. So that's the Freedom to Vote Act. The second one we have is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which we actually feel like is more of a defensive bill, which is basically, it allows us to, if there are any bills passed in certain jurisdictions that have a history of voter suppression, we can there's automatic preclearance, which is a review from federal judges saying that this new voting law does not discriminate on a racial basis. So there's a preclearance part, but then there's also, it allows any individual, any organization to also sue on behalf of the Voting Rights Act in order to say that, hey, this law is discriminatory, regardless of wherever you are in the country. So one's more of an offensive way to attack voting rights. Another one's a defensive, having a backstop of the judiciary to say, hey, this is how we're going to protect voting rights. The final one that we're also doing is DC statehood. So obviously, DC statehood, the population of DC doesn't have a voting doesn't have a voting voice in our Congress. And for a lot of other reasons that I won't get in right now, it is very beneficial for us to have DC represented in Congress for the issues that we're trying to pass. With that being said, we do have this statement that we always say, which is we can't have a healthy environment without a healthy democracy. And what that essentially means is that with environmental justice, with any environmental injustice, I should say, the people that are being discriminated against are in this situation because historically they have not had a voice in our democracy. So whether that's Black people with racism, whether that's women, whether that's immigrant communities, they are not representing our democracy. So the heart of us being able to effectively address our environmental issues starts with allowing those communities to have a full say in our democracy, both at the voting booth, as well as during redistricting and drawing maps that truly do represent those communities to their full extent. And that will be how we can put in elected officials that can pass the legislation that we need on the environmental side.
Got it. Thanks. And I know that I'm not sure that when you mentioned this, so we sort of talked about this with you in advance, but there is also a lot of conversations about sort of protecting the election judges. That's something that we're looking at here in Maryland. The election workers, the people who do the work to maintain who are the ones who we when we go to vote, they're the ones who are making sure on a in person, on the ground level, making sure that our votes are protected and fair. We have legislation going through Maryland right now that is protecting the election officials. Is that something you're seeing elsewhere as well? Justin?
Absolutely. I think, in light of everything that happened in 2020, including January, January 6th, that has become a huge issue. We have seen a lot of elected officials not feel safe, doing their job. We've seen a lot of election officials stop doing their jobs or retire or leave early because of that. And so finding ways to give people the fiscal support in order to do it. So go to budgets and make sure that they actually have enough money to do their job in the first place, but then also put in the protections in order to make sure that any intimidation that might be done by individuals aren't getting to those election officials is extremely important. And we're seeing various states do things in order to try to make sure that their election officials feel safe and not feel the influence of any partisan pressure.
Got it. I appreciate that. And so, and going over now to Jake to sort of follow up on that idea. What impacts do you see the voting rights legislations and protections have on our local communities, especially those who are disproportionately affected by environmental issues?
Yeah, so it makes big changes, right? We've talked a lot about how part of the job of the state board of elections is to make sure we have uniformity across the state and to make sure that all voters have the right to access the ballot. And so making sure drop boxes are accessible in all communities, making sure early voting centers, the General Assembly has done an extraordinary job of making sure that early voting centers are made to be accessible, right? So depending on the size of your county, you need to have 50% of the population within 5 miles or 80% of the population within 10 miles. But to make sure that our voting centers are secure and accessible. And I think when you start talking about areas of the state impacted by environmental issues, whether it's climate change on the Eastern Shore and it being more difficult to get around, or it's frankly in areas that have been hit by environmental racism over the years, and making sure that those communities have access to the ballot so they can speak out and vote for folks who are going to represent their best interests. Is something the State Board of Elections is really focused on. Kristen, the other thing I just want to touch on, you mentioned the Protecting Election Officials Act of 2024, which is Senate Bill 480 and House Bill 585 for folks playing at home. It's sponsored by the governor. It's got a great bipartisan support in both chambers. One of the things that keeps local election officials up at night is recruiting of election judges, right? It is an extraordinary effort that is done every 2 years in the state. If you want something to help your community, to serve your community, sign up to be an election judge. To be frank, one of the biggest obstacles we find is in the more blue areas of the state, making sure that we have Republican and unaffiliated voters sign up to be election judges. So as you're talking to your friends and neighbors, we need to have those election judges, and being able to recruit them is so important. And unfortunately, over the last 4 years, we have seen folks being concerned about signing up to be an election judge because of what's happened in other states. Thankfully, not in Maryland, but because of what's happened in other states. And this legislation, which has the strong support of the State Board of Elections and some bipartisan support, can help to give some security and some, faith to those folks who sign up to be election judges.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jake. And so, just to jump back to Justin for a second. So we're working on this here, but we're looking, as what Jake was talking about, is that the work in Maryland and the ability to recruit judges in Maryland is affected by the national conversation. And so what happens nationally is affects us at home. So how can we as Maryland and Marylanders engage in the national conversation? Are there things that we should be doing, we can be doing as individuals here that can help support the work nationally, either at a federal level or in other states?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, just talking about the success of your election system. So obviously you have one of the most accessible election systems, and you have had successful elections, particularly, when you talk about how there are both Republicans and Democrats that have won under the system. So you have contested elections, yet there hasn't been the questioning and the disinformation that we've seen in other states. So you can have a very accessible system and still win clean, free, and fair elections. So I think that's number one. The second thing is also on the federal level. Right now in the House, you have two great champions, with Senator Sarbanes and Senator Raskins for everything democracy, right? They've led the way. They are model kind of democracy champions in the House. One of the things we would really love to see too on the federal level is for you to now start to push your senators that same way. Right now, basically the biggest obstacle to passing democracy legislation is the filibusters. Well, 2 years ago when we had the trifecta in Washington D.C., that was what was prevented. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act from being passed is basically a filibuster. So really getting champions in the Senate in order to really push for filibuster reform, in order to make sure that we can pass that legislation, is really one way that Maryland can help out a lot.
So Maryland, even though we're a small state, can be impactful, is what I'm
Absolutely.
hearing.
Yes.
That's always nice to hear. I think that sometimes we are, I mean, Maryland is a very small state, and we feel a little bit, and it can feel a little bit like we're lost in the national conversation in terms of what is our impact and how can we, how are we making a difference? And, Jake, do you have anything to, do any way that you'd want to sort of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the other part on that is Maryland has been a leader on these issues, right? We've been a leader on election day registration, same day registration, automatic voter registration. We've been a leader on enfranchising ex-offenders for the right to vote. We've made it easier for folks to vote by mail, to vote in person, early voting. And we've done it all while making sure that our elections are secure and trusted. And that's not an easy thing to do. That does take, we're gifted in the state. That does take bipartisanship at times. Sometimes bills have not passed with a bipartisan majority, but they've passed with the majority of this state. And what we have seen is Maryland being a, not to be cheesy here, but a beacon of hope of how to run elections and how our voters thankfully have that faith in those elections, can give other states and the federal government something to follow in that regard. And I think Maryland continuing to lead on this issue is only beneficial to the entire nation in that regard.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective. And going back from the big picture to the small picture, I'm just going to jump ahead. I see a question in the chat from MJ, who talks about having had some town council members who tried to restrict residents voting in town elections. A council member, after an official election notice, altered an official election notice in a way that could serve the benefit of the incumbent candidates, who then retaliated against election official who documented and report that interference. So I'm not sure the specific, like where this is talking about, but the question is sort of what state laws apply to small town elections, and get really some details about sort of the nitty gritty about it all.
Yeah, and I saw Danielle put in the chat asking MJ to reach out, and Danielle, if you can pass along information. A lot of state laws don't apply to local elections, right? Most local elections in this state are run by the locality, by the municipality, right? We have 157 municipalities in the state, and I think all but Baltimore City are in one form or another run by the local government. I think that's an issue that should absolutely be brought up to the representative in the General Assembly, because laws can be changed. And I think shining a spotlight on when things go take a turn like this is only beneficial to making sure people know that they can have faith in their elections by stopping bad behavior when it occurs. But the way it works in Maryland, both in campaign finance laws and in conduction of elections, is a lot of them are run by the local municipality.
Got it. And another nitty gritty question from our friend Nika. Can you talk a little bit about the process of like what the process is in Maryland for getting questions on the ballot at a state level?
So we don't have a initiative, right? The way that other states do, where you can directly put something on the ballot. What we do have is a referendum. And so if a law has been passed by the General Assembly that you want to petition to the ballot, there's a process for gathering signatures. It's 3% of the amount, not the voters, the amount of folks who voted in the previous general election need to be collected. And different local jurisdictions have different criteria, and some of them do have more of an initiative process. But for the state, there is no initiative process.
Got it. Thanks for that clarification. Yeah, every state is different on this, which is interesting. I know, some states have very, very long ballots with propositions that were petitioned by citizens, and that is not how we operate, although there are ways that one can engage. Justin, going back to you, the questions from the chat is, what have you seen are there any trends you've seen in sort of voting behavior this election cycle that we should be looking out for in terms of turnout, in terms of what has been working in terms of getting people to the polls?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit difficult one, just because most of the elections so far have been kind of with the Republican primary, so very small sample size and very interesting motivations from that particular group of folks. But one of the things, we are constantly seeing, and we saw, unfortunately, examples in New Hampshire, is the disinformation. So we will see numerous attempts for people to mislead and distract and put out false information to change voting habits, right? And because of artificial intelligence and because of where technology is these days, like, we've already seen it happen where, I think in New Hampshire, there was a phone message that went out with someone impersonating President Biden saying, do not vote. And so I think that's really the biggest thing I think we're all looking for in the voting rights community, is being able to rapidly respond to disinformation as it comes, and really be able to talk to our community to get the right information out there and work with our election officials in order to make sure that happens. Once again, this all goes back to trust in the people that run our elections. Maryland has that, and I think the closer we can get to a Maryland model nationally, the better we'll all be. But until then, we'll try to stay vigilant and be able to respond back as we see disinformation happen.
And if I can chime in there, Kristen, our administrator, Jared Demarinis, is fond of saying one of our top obligations is to combat mis, mal, and disinformation, which is absolutely one of the biggest threats that elections have right now. It's there in Maryland, at least. There are plenty of states where election officials and legislators are trying just to reduce access to the ballot. But in Maryland in particular, we have seen, we've seen misinformation. Obviously, it happens every election to some point or another, but it has grown, and some of the AI and deep fakes has only added to it. Right, there's a variety of bills in front of the legislature this year trying to define and address synthetic media and how to tackle this problem. It's a very tough one. We have First Amendment issues, but voters being vigilant, asking questions about the information they're seeing, doing research from reputable sources to ensure information is accurate, and just taking a minute before they just hit that retweet or post share button and just think, does this pass the smell test? is tremendously valuable and necessary for the protection of our elections.
Yeah, this is obviously in the news all over the place. It's been daily in the news, I think, for the last couple of weeks and regularly over the past many months. And so is there a role and I'd be interested for both of you, what is the role for organizations like Maryland League of Conservation Voters in terms of being like, how should we be working more as a trusted resource to help combat this disinformation? Is there a role for groups like ours, and are there tools that you can offer for individuals who are being bombarded by information from all sides in terms of how to differentiate what is good information and what is not? And this is for either of you.
No, absolutely. So I think it, particularly because LCV is an environmental organization, so you're a trusted source for a certain segment of the population. I think it's incredibly important in order to be able to say, hey, this is what's going on. This is what you need to know, and also work with your community leaders, work with other folks you work with in order to make sure that organically the information about what's happening in our elections is spreading throughout the community, through trusted resources, or through trusted messengers, I should say. So I think that is one of the biggest things that LCV can do this election cycle, knowing that, once again, another large election, and that people will be hearing a lot from everything, but you are a trusted source, and that is needed.
Yeah, I would 100% agree on that. Like, LCV is a trusted source for voters, and so directing voters to LCV is important. When it comes to misinformation from campaigns, and this is not a partisan thing, I've seen plenty of misinformation on all sides of the aisle. It is more difficult to combat. State Board of Elections doesn't play a role in terms of verifying facts and statements. We do, however, I'll put in the chat if that's okay. The State Board of Election keeps a rumor website up to date when it comes to facts about voting. And so there are all sorts of rumors that can come out, especially when it comes to the increase in mail-in voting, that if you hear something that somebody is saying about elections that sounds like it might not be right, please go to the rumor control website. If you don't see it out there, please reach out to the State Board of Elections, right? And Kristen obviously knows how to hunt us down in our sleep, but being able to make sure that people have the information and so they have faith when they go vote is so important. And that's a role that we do try to actively play.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to hop in right there. Absolutely. I think also, being able to, whether you said connecting folks directly to the State Board of Elections or like different local election protection organizations, also arming people with, when they go to vote on election day, if something does happen to them that is questionable, whatever, that they have somebody to reach out to in order to answer those questions, I think is also another huge resource that LCV can provide.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we do partner with again, very much 501c3 election, nonpartisan election protection organizations. It's something that we do, especially in years where we don't have everybody in the General Assembly running for elections. We put a lot of our time into these voter protection opportunities and doing election protection work. So please keep in touch with us. And I'm looking at the time, it's gone very quickly. I really appreciate both of you to spending your time and giving us so much resources. And I'll just reaffirm that that rumor control website that Jake put in the chat is an excellent resource. There's a lot of resources on the Board of Elections, so take some time in looking at that. But as we wrap up, I just want to thank Jake and Justin for joining us. I'm in the chat we talked a little bit about this bill to protect election officials. This is a bill that we are supporting. It is a bill that is a priority of the Moore administration and of a lot of people in it. So there's an action alert for you to take action to help us get that over the finish line. And thank you all for joining and for your support for our work. If you have any questions that weren't answered today, you can always send them to us by email, and one of us will get back to you. And before you leave, we do have some events that we will coming up. Stay tuned for our next email about our next Friday digest. These happen every Friday at noon, and we hope that you'll join us again next week for another informative session. Let us know what you want to hear about, and please take our short 5-question survey that is in the chat now. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks Jake and Justin for jumping on.
Thank you.